Welcome to the stage, linguist, author, and New York Times columnist John McWhorter, and political data analyst and co-founder of Blue Rose Research, David Shor.
Hey, David.
Hey.
So, we're going to talk, right?
Yeah, that's the plan.
Let's talk about how to craft an argument and how we've done that. And I think you and I actually occupy different places in the ecosystem, but I think we're both focused on the same sorts of things, which is how to change minds rather than just to say stuff. And so, David, talk a little bit about exactly what your place in the ecology is today, and I'll do the same thing, and then we can begin.
All right, so, my name is David Shor. I run a data science company in democratic politics called Blue Rose Research. So, our basic thing is that we survey extremely large numbers of people. We did 26 million interviews last year. We tested something like 40 to 50,000 pieces of content. These are really big numbers. It's crazy. And this allows us, and then in those surveys, we randomly expose people to content so that we can actually scientifically learn what persuades people and what doesn't persuade people. We've done this across tens of thousands of pieces of content. We've learned a lot. I'll probably talk a little bit about that. So that's, where I come from, and I'll hand things back to you.
Well, what I do, really, my day job is teaching something called linguistics at Columbia University. But I also have this other thing where I write editorials and do the occasional podcast. Mainly it's writing that I like doing. And for the past 4 years, I've been doing that for the New York Times. And my job is to try to convince people, and my sense has always been that writing an editorial is not about just writing the way I feel, but trying to write about whatever I'm thinking about in a way that somebody might come from it thinking differently than they had before. And that's different from yelling, and it's different from calling people names. And so it's not something that I usually think about consciously, but being asked to talk on this today has made me think, what are my guideposts for when I sit down and I have an opinion which I can tell I'm going to need to take the reader through in order to get them to understand where I'm coming from. And so, for example, in some circles, if people know who I am, they think of me as the contrarian. They think that I sit down and think, how am I going to make people mad today in order to get eyes? And it's not that. It's usually, it's almost always that I'm thinking, here's my opinion. I know that probably a critical mass of people share it, but they feel like they're not supposed to say it, or they're not sure that they really believe it. I think I am going to try to get it across so that they feel more comfortable with what I think everybody knows is true. And I do that about language, I do it about race, I do it about music. That's what I try to do. And so, David, I know you have this down to a science, I know, from observing your work and talking to you, including quite recently, whereas what I'm doing is more a matter of editorializing. But I wonder if you would agree with this, which is one of the main things that I try to think about and that you probably end up finding. When you are dealing with people who have an opinion different from you, I find that there's some people whose inclination, that the cartoon version is to roll your eyes and say that other people are quote unquote crazy. And by that, you don't mean that they're cognitively impaired, but just that they're thinking wrong and that it's a flaw on their part. That's almost never true. If somebody has an opinion different from yours, it's your job to try to get behind their eyes. Imagine walking through life as they do in the same way that you do, and processing reality the way they do as a perfectly sane person. 99.9% of the time, it's possible to do that. It's almost like what I hear being an actor is like. You have to try to be that person. And then once you can be that person, then this is where you go in for the kill, so to speak. Once you can see how they're thinking, then you know what their objections are going to be to what you initially state, and you anticipate it, and you get it. You get at the objection. And so my idea is always, some of my editors, I have trouble with them with this because there's this way that we use the word defensive. Now, to be defensive should mean to defend yourself too much. Many people think defensive is if you try to defend yourself at all. No, no. Sometimes you have to be a lawyer. So the idea is get behind their eyes, see that they're sane, and be able to anticipate every single one of the objections so that then you can move ahead and make your point. So my ideal is that if someone comes back with an objection, like say in a panel discussion, that's not what we're doing, but you should never be surprised by what that objection was because you did your homework and you got behind their eyes. Then you can move on and say, despite that neither this nor that are true, my opinion is this. Now that's not always going to create God's truth, but it's better than thinking people are insane. Does that make sense?
Oh, I agree with that completely. In the context of politics, I think Democrats and Republicans really dislike each other a lot. And if you can, almost all of the successful politicians throughout Democratic politics really would start by acknowledging truths that the other side would accept. Because a lot of Republicans just think that liberals are crazy. And if you can go and say an obviously true thing that liberals don't like to say, then conservatives will go, oh, this is actually a human being. Maybe I should listen to him. And just to give some concrete examples of that, Barack Obama very famously would start by saying, oh, the government needs to tighten its belt, but, Bill Clinton would do the same thing. And, my favorite example from last cycle is, before Biden dropped out, a lot of the most effective ads would start with, we know he's old. The single most effective ad that Kamala Harris made last cycle, out of like 1,000, was her staring in front of the camera and saying, the cost of food and groceries is too high. Just acknowledging your weaknesses really does a lot to make everything else you say credible.
Definitely. And then there is something related to this, which is, and I wonder if this is part of the kind of research that people in your line of work do, which is that one way that people are not crazy is that people rank things differently. And so, for example, and I'm going to go for the jugular here, there are some people for whom racism is the most important metric in judging anything that race has remotely anything to do with. That's one way of looking at it. That doesn't mean that they don't value other things, but for them, whether it's racist is the top of things. A lot of that was especially prominent starting in 2020. I think we're all familiar. Now, for most people who I know, not know of, but who I know, racism might not be the top thing. It might be the second thing. For them, abortion might be the top thing. For them, the environment might be the top thing. Race might be third, might be fourth. It's not that it doesn't matter, but it's not the top. And so, the way different minds work is that kind of ranking. It's not just that either you value the importance of battling racism, or if you don't, you are a racist. There are certain people who encourage you to think in that way, but that's not how human cognition works. It's really a matter of priority, and often, if you are having an argument or you're talking about an issue with people, the truth is that where you're going to come is not that you're going to agree, but you're going to realize that your rankings just happen to be different. That for you it's 1, 2, 3, 4, for them it's 2, 3, 4, 1, but they're not crazy. And what that means is this. It is rare that anybody is going to deserve to be called a somethingist at the end of these sorts of arguments. And so, for example, it is not true that to have voted for Donald Trump makes you a racist. It's tempting, I get it, I feel that here, but it doesn't work here. And all you have to do is step beyond your doorstep, no offense to anyone here, but I have known a great many white people who voted for Trump where in every single other aspect of their life, including who their spouse was, it is highly unlikely that they are bigots. It's just that they like something else about Trump. And of course now we've seen that amply confirmed in how many brown people voted for the man. You can't say that they're racist, or if you do, if you call them self-hating, you don't mean it. And so that means that calling people an ist, or calling somebody, you're a classist, you are whatever an ist, that's not good. And it also, this is the problem with it. If you're watching a debate and one person melts down and calls the other person a name, they lose, even with their fans. I've seen that happen with 2 people I'm not going to name in high-profile debates over the past 5 years, where, in this case, racist, a white person who wasn't quite observing the etiquette of treating the person with kid gloves just used cold, hard logic. One of the people, I shouldn't say this, but in one case, the white person was Canadian and didn't know our rules, and so just kept going boom, boom, boom. And the black person melted down and called the person a racist. Both of those people have not gotten over this on social media since last night. And that's because the calling names is unpretty. And what it comes from is a sense that different priorities mean that people are evil, when really it just means that, big surprise, people are different, right?
Yeah, so two things I want to say about that. Obviously, I'm going to just say I agree with you completely all day. But
Good.
so the first thing, I just wanted to share some polling, where I remember in 2019, we did polling of African-American Trump voters. And we asked, do you think that Donald Trump is a racist? And 40% of them said yes. They just still voted for him. There's there's just other things that people care about, like you said. And then the other thing, which I just thought was funny, because, there were focus groups on this, was, just this idea that, the idea that there may be some powerful racist white people out there is like less scary or alarming to non-white people than it is to white liberals. They in many ways, people have had to make peace with this fact. And so it's a little less concerning. And then, the other point I just wanted to make was about negativity. A question that I get a lot is, as a pollster, as a data scientist in politics, people come to me and they're like, oh, you're the problem. You're the reason why politics is so terrible. And, the funny thing is every time I've ever done a test, it has said you should be more positive and, you should talk more about things that affect people's lives and do less name calling. Because the thing is, the median voter, likes Democrats less and also hates Republicans less than I do. And it's just an important thing to remember. The actual reason why there's so much negativity and polarization is because both sides' elites hate each other. It's not actually, what the voters want. The returns to, not name calling and being positive just show up in basically every experiment I've ever done.
David, let me ask you a question. This is a genuine question. Based on what you're doing, how would you predict that polarization is either going to increase or decrease over the next couple of years? How do we move the needle, or better, that's a cliched question. Do we see the needle moving? And if so, why did that happen?
Well, the pattern has been that polarization has been increasing inexorably since roughly when my 1974 or so with Watergate.
I was going to say, really, it was almost as bad then. People always think it was just last week, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, at least then bombs were going off and stuff. But politics has consistently gotten a lot more negative. And I think that there's, a couple of reasons for that. I think that, negative content is more engaging. I think something that's just very interesting about the media environment is that, if you look at, this gets a little wonky, but if you look at foxnews.com and people who visit foxnews.com, if you just look at people who have been there in the last month, that's only a 45% Democratic group. So a little bit more Republican than the country overall, but not by that much. But then if you look at it on an impression-weighted basis, as in, you weight every person by how often they go to the site, suddenly it becomes a 12% Democratic group. And the reason for that is that they roughly 1 in 10 of their visitors visit 50 times more than everybody else. And those people are extremely ideological. And so the basic problem with our media environment is that there's this psychotic, hyper-engaged 1 to 2% of the population on both sides that just consumes massively more media than everybody else. And that means that, what the algorithms choose to show people and what kinds of content the media companies try to make is all targeted to them and not at everybody else. But then everybody else sees it. And this is a really new dynamic. In the old days, you could only watch the nightly news once. Maybe the real sickos could subscribe to the New Republic or something. But and so this, I think, there's just these deep forces that have really encouraged the media to be a lot more negative, even if it's not what most people want.
And negativity is extremely entertaining. I've been told by actors, it's going to make it seem like I spend a lot of time with actors, which I do, actually. And they say that the easiest thing to portray is anger. You just start yelling. And it's fun. I like scrolling through what's now called X, just watching people being mad. That has become my version of the sitcom lately. But the fact is, most people are not inherently angry. They're not that passionate about politics. And it's constructive to try to talk to somebody who, I remember, I've been doing whatever I'm doing in the media for 25 years now. And when I first started doing it, people would give me advice. And I remember there was this guy, younger than me at the time, actually, but thought a lot of himself. And he said, well, John, what you have to remember is that most people are just buying groceries. And, he was not right about most things, I found, but that was actually true. That I thought to myself, yes, that's the typical person, not people like him, not people like me, not people like you, not people who read our books. And that really is the truth. This is the challenge, though, in terms of people who are just buying groceries and then what human cognition is like. And this is the hardest thing, at least in my job. We are trained to think of things being either this or that. It's either red or it's blue, it's either black or it's white, and I don't mean that racially, but we're supposed to think in binaries. That's how the brain works. But life doesn't. And very often, things are a matter of degree. And it can be very hard to make people understand that the thing you've been focusing on, such that you process the degree, is something that they need to focus on and see the degree as well. And I found that if you identify that, if you acknowledge, for example, yes, racism exists, societal racism exists, but often the challenge is in saying, yes, but what role did this thing play in this particular event? And so I remember one argument I had with someone was when now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was accused of molesting a woman when he was in college. And I thought, frankly, that he should not have become a Supreme Court justice because either he lied about it or was extremely impolite about it. I thought that he should have said, if that happened, I'm very sorry. I knew many people who thought that because that event had happened, he shouldn't have been allowed to be a Supreme Court justice at all. And I remember saying to someone, do you believe that that act should disqualify him 40 years later from having an honorable position? In other words, what's the degree? And I found that a much more constructive conversation than how many of them could have gone. And that was a conversation where there was also something else, which is if you're having a debate with someone, if you're trying to present an argument, if there's any tension over it, you should know that you're not gonna best the person in the room right then. And when I write my columns, I often think if it's about a long-term issue, the readers are not just gonna, bow down to me there. The idea is to keep chipping away over the years, because often, and I know this from having been on the other end of it, if you convince the person, they're not gonna admit it, because it's embarrassing and you don't want to. I certainly won't, but you can look in their eyes and see something died a little bit, and it means that they're gonna go away and think about it, that's all. And all of these things happen gradually. That's another frustrating aspect about opinion, that you're dealing with a conversation that changes gradually, but it definitely eventually does,
Yeah, and I think that gets at another related point, which is just that, people can't change their mind unless they think. And that's like a really underrated statement. If people are laughing or if people are angry in response to what you're saying, they're not really thinking. And they're not really absorbing what you're saying. And so, if you're in a situation where things are highly charged, people aren't going to actually be listening to you for the basic reason that the processing just isn't going on. The blood isn't there.
David, I don't know. My sense has often been that laughter opens up the mind. Now, on the other hand, it can close it, and I hate to say this, but I think that a lot of the reason that our current president has his position is because he is a sterling stand-up comedian. He's just funny. I think he's funny, and he utterly disgusts me, but I think he is very funny, and I'm sure that for many people who are more concerned with groceries than with whatever Trump and Musk were arguing about yesterday, for them, the fact that Trump was so funny, had a lot to do with it. He's just a stand-up kind of guy. If there's too much laughter, yes, there's no thought, but it can also mean that somebody might open up to something that they might have considered inherently noxious 5 minutes before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it gets to some of the limitations, of science, where I think the advantage, so the basic dynamic, because I think a lot about engagement is, if you make a really funny video, then it will be, maybe like 30 to 40% less persuasive than maybe the very best video that you could imagine, but it will get shared and be seen by like 100 times more people. And if you like do the math, that's better. And so I think, with Donald Trump, like listening to Donald Trump do his like stream of consciousness, dialogue where he's talking about the birds and the windmills, like I'm sure that is less persuasive per minute than like Barack Obama or something talking about lowering
using
costs.
actual human language, right?
Right, but the flip side is I would not. Especially if I was not a liberal, I'm sure having Donald Trump's speech on in the background while I'm cooking or something would be funnier. I'm probably consuming way more of it. So that's kind of the trade-off. But I do think it is important that people do have to think really in order to change their mind.
David, you and I, you're not going to like this, but I have to make you do this. You and I were looking at some slides, and we're not using slides for any number of reasons that really don't matter. But one of them was a really cool slide, and it was the chart with the axis and can you describe it to the audience, because it's such an important part of what you do, and I learned from it, and I'm beginning not to learn new things.
Yeah.
Explain to them that chart.
All right, so we're going to describe a graph. Basically the way that we think about issues, which I think are underrated in politics, actually, is how much do people care about an issue? And that really changes a lot over time. When there's a terrorist attack, people care a lot about terrorism. When we started tracking this in 2020, COVID was the #1 issue that voters cared about, and now it's not. And then how much people trust Democrats versus Republicans on this issue. And I think, it's really underrated the extent to which this really varies. Like if you ask, what party do you trust more on border security? It's like 60% Republicans, 40% Democrats. But the flip side is if you say, oh, well, what party do you trust more on, climate change? Then it becomes 58% Democrats, 48% Republicans. And, in general, people have done this across a whole host of countries. And the joke sometimes is there's like a mommy party and a daddy party where like the right-wing parties do better with like security and taxes and all of the, so-called hard choices, while Democrats or the left do better on things that involve empathy, healthcare and poverty and all of this other stuff. But, the situation the Democrats are in, if you want to understand why Democrats lost, is if you look across the top 10 issues that out of 40 that voters cared about this cycle, Republicans had double-digit trust advantages on all of them, except for healthcare, where they had a 1-point lead. And so it's just, I think this is a really nice telling example of how, it encapsulates the strategic situation, where in 2020, the strategic situation where the top 2 issues that voters cared about were COVID and healthcare. And those also were the top issues that people trusted Democrats on. And so the strategic, as a political consultant, it was a very easy time. The advice was like, oh, well, we should talk about the thing that voters care about the most and also that voters trust us on. And the only thing we have to not do is not listen to the people who are telling us that we need to defund the police and abolish prisons. Very simple, very simple advice. And then we did that and we won and it was great. But this time it was just much more complicated. The issues that voters trusted us on the most, namely abortion and the environment, voters just didn't care that much about. Voters ranked abortion something like 30th out of 40. And I think climate change was like 34th. Well, meanwhile, all the things that voters trusted us on, that cared about, we just had these massive double-digit trust deficits. And so that's just a much harder situation.
Thank you for doing that, because that's a very important point, whether there is a visual illustration or not. And part of the reason I asked is because to the extent that changing political opinion is one thing and crafting an argument in a more general sense is another, I would say that one thing that I have learned and that I really feel like is advice worth passing on, which is not my usual, is how to get across an argument in today's times when attention is so fragmented. Typical political speech used to be 2 hours. Now, you couldn't get me to sit through something like that at gunpoint. I want to look at my phone. What do you do when people have less attention, and if you're talking to somebody, often it's going to be an event that winds up on YouTube where people are going to be looking at it in their phone. And I find that you should consider the number 3. Any argument that I make that's the way that I want it to be consists of exactly 3 parts. Each of the 3 parts has 3 subparts. That way, you can memorize it. You don't look at a script, you don't have a card, you just talk. But you can't do that unless it's easily memorized. And so 3, and then 3 bits within the 3, and then there's an opening, and then there's a closing. If you can do that, and you can keep your eyes focused on the audience instead of looking down at something, and you only hold people there for about 18 minutes, I think that in 2025, that is a good way of getting a point across in a way that's processable to people who, all of us, only have so much time to listen these days because there's so much competition. That's just something that I think about a lot. And it's also the way I write these days. And what was, I forget things that I write as soon as I write them. But the last thing in the Times was my exploration of the word problematic. Well, that was because somebody told me to do it, basically. And when that came up, the first thing I thought is, damn, that's not going to be able to be 3 pieces. It's going to be like 5 or 6 things. That's how I was thinking, because if I chose the topic, it would have been my tripartite ideal. And it's particularly useful in terms of oral public addresses. So I just wanted to get that in. In any case, David, do you have more that you want to share, or should we listen to what they're going to share with us?
I think let's do questions.
I think so. Ma'am.
People are really listening. So do you really think that it's a problem of attention span or depth in the content that is out there?
That is a very good point, because there is the fashion of the 2 and 3 hour long podcast interview. I personally do not partake of that form, but I know people do. I wonder if they do in a whole 2 or 3 hour session, or whether they listen to it in parts. And of course, there's fandom. If somebody's really famous, then they're going to be able to hold on to people for longer. The podcast format also tends to involve 2 people in exchange, which keeps you going as opposed to one person just droning along. So yes, there are holes in what I'm saying. I was thinking more of one person just sitting there and going. But it depends. Some people can pull an audience along more than others. But yeah, certainly the nature of the content is part of it.
The only thing I'd add to that is just, there's just this inherent trade-off with scale, where, there's these little YouTube shorts that are like 2 or 3 minutes long, AI-generated trash that have been seen by hundreds of millions of people. But, the flip side is like podcasts or long-form YouTube content, that's all seen by at most, maybe 11, 12% of the population. But those people are more likely to be tastemakers. A lot of elite persuasion ends up happening in those mediums, which then kind of filters down to the short form stuff. But the reality is, if you want to get 50, or like what sucks about politics is, in business, if you get 1% of people to buy your product, you will become fabulously wealthy. Politics isn't like that. You have to get 50% of people to vote for you. And that's just a very different problem. And so in that world, it's like, oh, I need to get as many 10, 15-second clips as possible. Last cycle, we started doing 6-second ads for the first time. The part of my heart died a little bit. But anyway, next question.
David, you made a comment about how your polling reflects that people don't want to see the negativity or the name calling, but obviously our current president has been very successful with a different model, and that seems to be just one of the many ways that he doesn't comply with the traditional sort of norms that we had for our leaders, like, disqualifying scandals and the ability to speak coherently and all of the things that make him so different, but also widely successful. What does your polling show about why that's working? And, do either of you have sort of responses or suggestions to what the successful opposition is to these strategies that, wouldn't have made sense 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think the really important thing about Trump, in this regard, is that he had a television show for like almost a decade that was literally centered around what an amazing and brilliant businessman he is. And I think that kind of skill of like, how do you create a story around yourself that centers like kind of how brilliant you are? How do you get tons of media coverage? That's just like not something that most politicians are trained to do. But the other thing I would say is, I think it's really easy, to look at Trump and see him as this like incredibly negative fire and brimstone person. And I think obviously in many respects he is. But if you really, and I wouldn't recommend this, like listen to hours of him talking, you'll see that it's a little more complex than that. He's making a lot of jokes. He's actually in many ways admitting the faults that his party has. He'll make fun of other people in his party. He'll be like, he'll break the mold in terms of hanging out with gay or trans people or being really into theater, and so I think it's a little more complex. But I don't know, maybe he has something to say.
I do. Trump is a black swan also, and any theory of social history has to account for the fact that there are hairpin turns. And there are two things about him. One is that bad hair day way of talking is something that we've never heard in someone of such influence before. Now, George W. Bush and Sarah Palin paved the way, but with Trump, that stand-up comedy as political statesman-like speech is new. There's a novelty to it, and so it makes him seem uniquely approachable. The thing is, when the next person comes along who talks like that, it won't be new anymore, and so it won't be as compelling. But we've seen what happened with the novelty. And then also, he channels a particularly potent impulse that I think overrides the person who's buying groceries' tendency against negativity, and that is that I'm told there is this massive resentment of the woke looking down on people who are not, the quote-unquote deplorables from an earlier conversation. And if that's true, then Trump ends up, grabbing into their feeling and saying that I represent you. And you combine that with the towel snapping way of talking, and you get somebody who is uniquely resonant right now. But it wouldn't work again. That's the thing about him. And so surprises come, but once the novelty wears off, another person won't be able to get away with the same thing, or they won't be considered as interesting unless they have something else to bring to the table, which might be more of the normal things that David and I have been referring to.
Yeah, I want to dwell on Trump a little bit more. He lives rent-free in
It's
all
such
our
an
heads.
uninteresting topic.
Yeah. I think there's also just this structural way to look at Trump that I think a lot of people like us don't really see, which is, basically the trick about Donald Trump was both in this election and in 2016, he was rated as considerably more moderate than the other persons he ran against, but also basically every other Republican who has run for office in the past 30 years. And like to us, that seems crazy. It's like, how could Donald Trump be moderate? And that's because, we're all afraid of Donald Trump because he's like a racist dictator, wannabe or whatever. But it turns out how much you care about racism, to be like blunt and use imprecise language, and how much you care about authoritarianism is really highly mediated by education. So like to give an example, or class or socioeconomic status. Like an example I like is we have a polling question, which is, do you think having a system of government where you have a strong president who doesn't have to deal with Congress or elections, would this be good or bad? And the good news is that bad beats good, 62-38, but number one, that's not that close. That's not that lopsided. That's closer than people would guess. And two, it's highly correlated with education. If you look at people who did not graduate from high school, good actually does beat bad. Like the reality is anti-authoritarianism is a pretty elite value. And so this creates this disconnect where Donald Trump is very extreme on authoritarianism and racism has the same, cross-sectional relationships. But then on the other hand, his defining characteristic in 2016 was that he said, I think we shouldn't have Social Security and Medicare cuts. I don't think we should ban abortion. But also, I want there to be fewer immigrants. And like the interesting thing, and this highlights what's kind of tricky about politics, how there are no dominant strategies, there's a lot of different things you could do, was that combination of views, I don't want entitlement cuts, but I do want there to be fewer immigrants, was extremely popular with like working class people, but not very popular with the highly educated people who controlled the media. And like other people had noticed this before, Tom Tancredo in 2008 tried to do the Trump strategy, but the problem was that working class voters don't watch a lot of news. And so they never had a chance of knowing who Tom Tancredo was. And so Trump's strategy was that he just needed to get his message out there of like, yo, I don't want to cut Social Security and I hate immigrants. And then the way that he did it was by being really negative. And to be clear, he paid a price for that. You know, like the most educated 20% of the country think that he's a demon. But by getting all of the attention, he really was able to get it out there and realign American politics. But you know, that was a situation where he had this new message and he really just needed it to be, you know, spread out. But that's very rare. Most things in politics aren't like that. Most of the time, there isn't this like huge hidden opportunity that folks aren't trying to exploit.
Notice that in his inarticulateness, he is also clear. He's not one for referring to highfalutin concepts, whereas I think in the last election, my heart sank every time Biden or then Harris would say that we're about to lose our democracy. Because to speak lightly, if we're talking about education, that word democracy to a person who might not have a college degree, it's not that it's meaningless, but it's extremely abstract. That's a Greek word. And we think of things that happened 250 years ago. We think of Congress, or we don't. We're about to lose our democracy. That wasn't right. It should have been that we're about to lose the power of the people, or something that a person understands immediately as they're quote unquote buying their groceries. And so Trump had an advantage of a sort, even in that way.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sorry, we're dwelling on Trump for so long, but I'll just say that, you know, I think the other big thing is just that, like Democrats, if you compare, like I like to go back and watch old speech clips. If you compare the Obama White House's press releases with the Biden White House's, the average grade level went up by, I think, 3 or 4 grades. And I think that's just one of the big challenges, is if you use language that people literally don't understand. You know, the median voter is like 50 years old and doesn't have a college degree. And if they can't understand what you're saying, or, you know, I'm not calling them dumb, like maybe they do understand, but
readily understand in real time, right?
Yeah, well, but they'll hear you, but if it's not actually how they talk, if they do not in their day-to-day life hear people talk like that, they're gonna think that you're weird and not trust you.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm going to take this away from Trump and politics and racism.
Talk about Grover Cleveland,
and
right.
Because I live in Dubai, by the way, and it makes me,
No
it
elections.
surprises me how much we're talking about this and how far away we're from that, because both are non-existent there. So it's just like very funny. But going back to the art of convincing, I think one of the most difficult thing is probably to raise money when you have a startup and you're fundraising. And when you're doing like your 5-minute speech, what is, you think, is the first feeling you need to create into the potential investor in order to invest, for instance? Like, what's the feeling that person needs to get, anyone in the room, to put like now $100 on this chair? Like, what's the feeling that the person needs to feel, in your opinion?
I would guess that you want the person to feel like there's some sort of potential for revolution, in the sense that it's beginning to feel like a long time ago now, but remember when Obama was a magic man? The idea was this is just the biggest, most important thing. If Cory Booker ran now, it wouldn't work because there was already Obama, but that, or people supposing that Trump is a magic man, which I can put my eyes behind someone's eyes and understand how they see him that way. And so the idea would be to make it clear why someone is different, which was impossible for Kamala, for example. She just didn't seem like she was about anything of her own because she couldn't speak away from the Biden administration. But it would be that I would imagine would open people's pockets. Although also tips about how to get across to people, such as not using language they don't use, or not holding people too long if you're just sitting in a room, might be germane as well. David, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, you know, I beg rich people for money all the time, for better or for worse. And I think
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that kind of cut against each other. On one hand, you want to be really attention grabbing and be like this is going to be revolutionary, this is going to be whatever. But I think one underrated point is clarity and conciseness and being information dense are actually very good, are actually very important. My co-founder's mother is a creative writing professor, and his dad's an astrophysicist too, which is a very funny combo. But she has this saying I really like, which is that, clear writing is extremely rare because it requires clear thinking. And because it's so rare, I think that, and by the way, this is true in a political context too, when you actually can communicate clear thinking, it's just worth a lot, and it's incredibly persuasive, and it makes you seem interesting and smart, and then people give you money, I think, in my experience. Obviously, you have to find the thesis and the product market fit and all that other things, but I think conciseness and clarity is underrated. I'll end at that.
I would have to agree. So, Kat, have we ended, or?
Okay, we can do one more.
Yeah, let's do one more.
All right, she got it.
Hello, I am from Venezuela, and that means that I'm very familiar with the narratives that we're hearing here in the US right now. I came here the January that Chavez was taking power. That's 26 years ago. I was just graduating as an economist. And the observation of what really broke Venezuela and got us to where we are was the polarization. And David, you started this talk about polarization, where I see the problem here, having lived this and having lost my country, is the polarization that I'm seeing in the United States, where we lost the capacity. When I first landed in the US, we could think different, but we could still be friends. And that's not the case anymore in the United States. If you think different, you get canceled. But we're talking about inclusive, but it's not true. So who's working and who's really understanding here in the United States? Because I see that if we don't solve the polarization, it doesn't matter. And I cannot emphasize that enough. It doesn't matter if we have a president that's Republican or Democrat, we're gonna break.
I mean, I agree with that, and generally, in my heart, I hope we fix this, and in my head, I'm like, oh man, things seem very bleak. It seems like we're just going to hate each other more and more until we kill it, until a bunch of people die. But I do think, we're reaching a breaking point, and there's a lot of energy to try to find, a more moderate, centrist thing. Elon Musk tweeted that yesterday, so we'll see how that works out. I don't know.
Briefly, I think that it's getting a little better because I sensed more polarization 2022 and before than now. I think the conversation shifted. David, I wouldn't be surprised, to be rather bleak, if something horrible happened, some sort of version of this civil war. It wouldn't be anything that would turn the country upside down, but there might be some hideous event. If that happened, it would be very, very sad, but it would help things even further shift to the middle because everybody would realize that that's not where we wanted to go. So that's how I feel about it right now. That was a kind of a pessimistic optimism, but that's another way of saying life. So.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.